The shot cracked across the plain like a branch breaking under a heavy foot, a sharp, single thing that splintered the grinding hush of late summer. Dust lifted in a ragged ribbon from the wagon wheels and hung in the parched light as if the sky itself had grown tired and gray. Emma Richardson felt the sound more than heard it, an ache in her chest, a quickening of the blood, and she shoved her youngest, Jacob, back beneath the canvas of the lean-to before she looked up. Sarah's small face peeked between her mother's skirts, brown eyes wide, hair stick-stiff with the grit of the road. For a breath, the world narrowed to the two children and the hollow of her own fear. They had been walking since dawn, the last of their provisions already light in the pack. Thomas had left 3 winters gone, with a promise he would return in spring with seed and wages. The fever took him in a week while Emma was bent over a churn, and the promise died with him in a room that smelled of lilies and strong, stale tea. After the funeral and the months that followed, trade and effort, harvests eaten by drought, the odd loan of flour from neighbors, there had been no more choice. The cabin was empty of everything but memories and the echo of Thomas's boots. The tax note came due. The baby blanket she'd kept for Sarah only made her more aware of what she could not keep. Pride was a stubborn companion, but hunger had the better memory. It could not be argued into leaving. She stood then, with the children at her skirts, listening to the plain and the man who cried out somewhere beyond the rim of the low hills. The rider wasn't aiming at them, she thought. Cowboy voices carried like distant thunder, quick and sharp. But to a woman alone on the Great Divide in 1873, no stranger's voice was without threat. Emma's hands found the small pistol Thomas had once polished for her. She ran her thumb along the wood, remembering his steady face as he taught her how to hold it so as not to frighten the children. Her hands trembled, but not with indecision. If they were to go on, she would carry enough courage for the 3 of them. A horse's shadow stitched across the dust, and then a man rode into sight. Broad-shouldered, hat low, eyes dark with the usual kindness of those who had seen the world hard, and chose, by spell or temper, to be gentler in it. He had the kind of face that smiled reluctantly, and laughed like a man surprised by his own good luck. His coat was patched, his saddle crusted with old sweat. A loping hound followed him, the dog's tongue hanging and its gait easy. He reined back a respectful distance, raised a hand, and said, without harshness or hurry, "You shouldn't be on the road alone with the children, ma'am. There's coyotes out after dusk. If you like, I can spare you a lift to Sweetwater Junction and some biscuits. My name's Preston Quincy."
For his part, he asked for nothing to make up for the debts he shouldered in his own chest, losses and separations that showed in the deep line at the corner of his mouth. He did not speak often of them. When he did, it was sparingly, layered like a man who had learned the cost of words. The months that followed were measured in work and small mercies. The drought that had gripped the spring began to loosen its teeth by degrees. Rain came in a night that surprised them all, thunder like a distant herd, big drops that found the cracked topsoil and sank, blessing and mess at once. Emma stood in the doorway with Sarah and Jacob, feeling the cool on her face and thinking of the apple sapling at the cabin that now might make it through. The rain left the porch slick and the garden smelling like hope. It was a simple thing, but in a land of small economies, a night's rain could change the ledger of a life. At Hallbrook's table, Preston learned to make himself useful in ways that had nothing to do with machinery. He coaxed Jacob into reading with a patience that felt like repair, and Sarah taught him the ways of a child's trust by offering him the single treasure she had, a crooked toy horse she had carved from a scrap. Emma watched as the children softened into the presence of this man who was not family, and yet, again and again, practiced family-like generosity. Her chest tightened with a guilt that tasted of betrayal and a warmth she had not expected. Thomas's portrait hung over the mantel, and in the flicker of the stove light, his eyes seemed gentler than they had in memory. Emma would sit at night with the kettle, and the two men, one born into her life by marriage, one who had arrived by accident and generosity, would talk about horses and the weather and the oddness of a world that continued while people broke and mended themselves quietly. There were tests to trust. Preston left for stretches, reckoned work that took him onto rougher ground, or the need to settle accounts, or the restless draw of the trail. Each time he rode away, Emma felt the old familiar cold of loss. In the quiet after he was gone, she could hear Thomas again, the cadence of his words about keeping the children warm and honest. The nights stretched long, and sometimes she would wake to the exact shape of her loneliness, a private ache she held with stubborn hands. Once, when a fence line gave under the winter winds and a foal took fright, Emma worked at the stall for a whole night with a farmer named Lyle to save the animal, and afterward Preston found her with her sleeves rolled, mud in her hair, and he did not think to call it brave so much as necessary. He only wrapped a blanket about her shoulders and said in a low voice, "You do more than any woman owes the world." There were moments of small humiliation, too. Neighbors who whispered at the general store, gossip that folded like spare cloth.
A widow who worked alongside ranch hands in those days could draw comment. Was she shifting her loyalty? Had she taken to the soft persuasion of a man's attentions? Emma learned to wear those looks like she wore the sun, something that might warm her but never define her. She had children to feed and a pride that would not let her seek pity with a bowed head. The turning came, as such things often do, in a quiet human hour. The winter had been harsh, snow like white thought blanketing the plain, cold that made breath hang like prayer. Food stores were low, and the hands at the ranch were thin around the cheek, as if the wind had taken a little of their meat. Preston returned from a long stretch on the trail with his face more weathered than when he'd left. He found Emma at the woodpile, the action of splitting logs a kind of meditation. Jacob had a fever, small and burning. The doctor in town was days away, and their coin less than a man might need to repay his conscience. Preston came in with a satchel and sat at the foot of the bed where Jacob lay. Sarah's hand stayed in his. The child was small enough that she trusted what the adult gave, and large enough to watch wonderingly as men behaved like angels dressed in work clothes. Preston opened the satchel, and from it took out a small bottle of medicine, bitter as a promise, and a tin of biscuits wrapped in cloth. He had ridden to town and bought what he could, and in his face there was that steady, practical compassion that had become for Emma the shape of one quiet day's mercy turned into another. When Jacob slept and the favor broke, Emma sat by the stove and felt the slow loosen of a knot in her chest. She had thought for a long time that grief would remain a permanent fixture, a sort of furniture in the house one could not rearrange. But there, warmed by an old hearth and the small miracle of a child's breath evening out, she felt the space in which another life might live. Preston's hand hovered over the table as he carved up the last of a pot roast for supper. He looked up, and his eyes asked a question he had not yet put to words. "Miss Richardson," he said finally, without pretense, "you ever think of marrying again?" The question was simple and heavy in the cabin smelling of smoke and stew. Emma's hand stilled on the cloth, and her reply came slow. "Every day," she said, "but a woman cannot trade her past for safety. Thomas was my husband. He is not easily set aside." "Nor should he be," Preston said, quickly, as if to shield what he knew was true and tender. "I don't ask you to put him aside, only to consider that things don't have to be the same to be good." He told her then, in halting honesty, of the loosened ties he'd carried, a sister who'd gone west and not come back, a small claim he had in Colorado that hadn't given fruit, a life of leaving that had worn him thin. "I've been a wanderer," he admitted. "Thing is, I'm tired of wandering. I look around, and I see people with things, home, family, and it makes me want what they're wearing. Not taking, mind, asking, if you'll have me, in some way to help shoulder the load, to tend, to stand when it gets hard. Emma imagined his hands, calloused, steady, and she imagined their joining as something practical and hands-on, a rotation of labor and care, of fences mended and children's schooling kept to order. But there was also the private, dangerous part of it, that desire to love again, to let a man into the rooms where her grief still lived, and to find, perhaps, that the grief would not be diminished, but layered, made wider to accommodate a new presence. She thought of Thomas's portrait across the mantel. "If I were to say yes," she said at last, "it would not be because I have forgotten him. It would be because our children deserve more than my stubbornness for a memory. They deserve a home with two hands and a hearth that does not coldly judge. Would you be willing to step slow?" Preston's answer was a quiet laugh and the softest kind of nod. "I'll step as slow as you need. I know a man has to earn his place, and no man is entitled to fill a hole left by another. I'll build something beside what you've planted." The acceptance wasn't a moment of fireworks. It was a pair of hands joined across a table that had seen soup boiled and bread broken and where children's crayon marks slowly multiplied by the edge of the board. It was also, in the larger sense, a decision to allow the possibility of joy into a life that had been cut ragged. Emma folded that possibility like a neat square and set it aside beside the kettle. Winter gave way to a cautious spring. The ranch, longer in on its feet for having held together through cold months, began to offer the kind of small celebrations that build the sentiment people call community. There was a harvest fair in Sweetwater Junction where a jar of Hallbrook preserves won a ribbon, and Preston showed up with a sun-browned hat and a blush that did not match the plainness of his face. He had begun, over the months, to integrate himself into the fabric of their days. He repaired the pump, he taught Sarah to rope a loop around a barrel, and when the children snored, he sat in the veranda and read aloud from a book of poems he'd bought in town, a luxury he'd call improving the mind, and Emma listened to the sound of him making rhythm out of words. There were still arguments and fears. People asked the children questions they shouldn't, and Emma had to set boundaries like stakes in the garden. She took offense once at an old neighbor's comment about a young widower doing his duty, and Preston answered by working all day to fix the neighbor's broken fence, shoring up dignity with labor. Reverend Walsh officiated at a modest ceremony in the Hallbrook parlor in the new year of 1874, a winter wedding after a long season of frost. There were no great feasts, only bread and stew and stories, and the children's faces shone with the simple, unapologetic delight of belonging to a family that bore their name in its tending. On the night before the wedding, Emma stood alone beneath the stars, a shawl about her shoulders, Preston's coat folded over the fence rail. The sky was generous, the way it had been the night she and Thomas had first walked arm in arm, before the world wore them down with its small cruelties and greater necessities. She raised her face to it, and felt, like Thomas's hand on her mind, the weight of the past and the promise of the future. There was grief still, a constant, like the ache of a tooth that would not stop. But grief did not preclude gladness. It lived beside it, a companion in the house of human feeling. "Are you certain?" Preston asked when he came to her under the thin map of sky. There was a timbre in his voice, careful and raw. She thought of Sarah's laugh, and Jacob's stubbornness, and the way the apple sapling had unfurled green against the fence. "Certain enough," she said, "and if I'm not, well, I'll learn. We'll learn together." Their vows were simple, pledged in front of a small group of neighbors whose hands had touched their lives in ways both small and enormous. Reverend Walsh's blessing was brief, a prayer for bread and roof and patience. "May the Lord keep this household in work and love," he intoned, and the words, simple and honest, felt like a benediction. The seasons turned. The garden that Emma tended with careful hands became a place of miracle by human measure, beans that climbed, a patch of marigolds that made pollinators sing, and a steady harvest that meant coin could be laid by for next winter. For Emma, the most unanticipated proof of a life mending itself was the morning she woke with a steady, persistent hope in her chest that was not the fear-born hunger of years, but the quiet prelude to something like expectation. Months later, when she stood at the well, drawing water and feeling the first weight of life inside her, an answer to a prayer she had never entirely formed, tears sprang to her eyes. She thought of Thomas, not as a rival, but as the man who had shaped her into a woman capable of loving again. She thought of Preston, who had learned how to be present without claiming repair for what had been broken by time. There were small resistances. A cousin in town muttered that a woman who remarried would lose the memory of the dead. Emma thought of Thomas's laugh and his slow hands. She refuted such words by tending the life within her and by telling stories to Sarah and Jacob of their father, keeping him alive in the voice she used to recall how he could whistle a tune and how he liked his coffee. The children learned that love could be multiplied rather than replaced.
Sarah braided a ribbon into Preston's hat and declared him always my friend. And Jacob, who once trembled like a reed in a storm, began to stand straighter at the fence, pride lifting him as if by warm light. The most sudden test came in a thunderstorm that ripped across the valley and tore at the dirt with a fury that felt personal. A bolt struck a lone tree by the corral and set a small blaze. The ranch hands rallied, water was thrown and pails were slammed. Emma found her fingers blistered and burned, and found she did not notice the pain because the urgency of saving the barn overrode everything but action. Preston carried buckets. Robert Hallbrook shouted orders like a man born to command. The children were wrapped in wet blankets, watching with the wide, careful gaze of the young at a spectacle. When the last ember was stamped down and the rain softened to a hiss, the men stood in a circle, wet and exhausted, and Preston said nothing more heroic than, "We did it," as if their lives had been measured in such steady refusals to break. That night, when the fire in the stove made the small room glow like a lantern caught inside glass, Emma rested her head on Preston's shoulder and felt the slow rising of the child inside her. "We did it," she repeated, and it was not empty pride. It was the truth of small, shared costs that give a life its solidity. In the years that followed, the Hallbrook Ranch grew steadier. The children, taller and less given to fits of grief, learned to find themselves in the rhythm of chores and school lessons. Preston and Emma worked as partners of necessity first, then of affection, then of a quieter, harder love that did not demand to be sung. The apple sapling became a tree that bore quiet fruit, and there were nights when the family would sit on the porch watching the sky make its slow economy of stars. Emma kept Thomas's portrait in the parlor. It became less a shrine and more a witness. The past, she had discovered, did not shrink when replaced by tender present. It extended itself, like root into soil, making room for new things without erasing the old. The final sign of restoration came in a spring when a new child was born, a small mouth hungry and fierce and familiar in its claim. For Emma, holding the infant, there was a fullness that was not naive but courageous, a recognition that life keeps coming, that sorrow and joy live in the same house, and that to accept love again was not to betray a memory, but to honor it by letting it see its fruits. Preston watched the children in their ease, Sarah chasing the dog through the yard, Jacob fixing a wagon wheel with grown hands, and he thought often of the improbable grace of a woman who would not be tamed by the open country, and yet who chose to share her hearth with a man who had rough things in his past. He loved Emma not because she was docile or simple, but because she had a backbone the way Thomas had one, a steady core of decency. Jacob's hands became honest in the way a farmer's are honest, calloused, quick, able to mend what broke, and to know when to leave a thing to rest. They loved and quarreled, sometimes loudly, sometimes in the low, stubborn silences of kin. There were afternoons when the boys would ride out to the far fence and test the horizon like boys do,
and evenings when Emma would scold a daughter for coming home with mud up past her knees. Preston kept watch in his way, a steady presence at the edge of things, teaching the children to shuck beans and to hold a plow with the patience that keeps a season's work from being wasted. He did not talk often of the stitches that lay beneath his own years, but once, when a thunderstorm came through with a wind that drove the rain like a curiosity against the porch, he told Jacob, "You'll learn to read a sky before you can read much else. It tells you what you'll need." The apple tree grew broader, its trunk thickening into a pillar that shadowed children and chairs alike. In late autumn, its branches turned brown and bare, and in spring it startled everyone with a flush of blossoms so quick it felt like a permission. The tree had become a map of days, climbing place, hiding place, a rack for stringing lanterns at harvest time. Once, when a limb drooped heavy with fruit, Jacob set a ladder and came down with a basket, and the household ate apples until the jars took the surplus and the kitchen smelled of sugar and steam. Time did not dissolve older things, it braided them. Thomas's portrait in the parlor kept its place, a steady point in the house's geometry. Children who had known the photograph from infancy learned to say his name without it tripping the mouth. Emma would sometimes stand before the portrait and look for a moment that was less about grief than about conversation. "He did his best," she would tell the picture, as if reassuring both the man there and the memory in herself. In those small acts, the past kept its dignity. It was neither hostage nor tyrant. It became, quietly, one of the hands that guided the family's work. Neighbors came and went. There was old Mr. Harlan, who visited with jars of pickled things and a head full of tall tales he had long stopped revising for truth. He would sit on the porch and tell of a fox that outsmarted him once, or a youth that had learned better by falling than by talking. The Hallbrooks had other neighbors too, women who exchanged recipes and news, men who met in the feed shed to speak of weather and the market price for cattle. They treated each other with the loose civility of people who knew the land's demands. Favors were paid with labor, and grief met with pies and quiet meals left on doorsteps. There were smaller reckonings among the family, arguments that burned like small fires and left a place for gentleness. When Sarah announced, one summer dusk, that she would marry a young man who worked the neighboring fields, Emma's first answer was a breath, a check of whether the young man had character, whether he could meet hunger without flight. The ceremony was plain and held beneath the apple tree, the branches casting a lattice of light and shadow over faces. Thomas's portrait watched from the parlor window, even as laughter rose and baskets of bread were passed. Preston, with a tenderness that surprised the guests, walked Sarah to the place and put his hand on her shoulder, as if the gesture could pass something steady along. Emma folded her hands and let the day be what it was, a new root extending from the tree of their life. Children leave as they must, but departure here was not an erasure. Jacob stayed longer than anyone thought, apprenticing himself to a neighboring wagon maker for a season, and coming home with better tools and a plan. He returned with a wife who could mend a hoof and make a fine stew, and their first child bore the blunt shape of Jacob's jaw and Sarah's eyes. The house shifted to fit them. Rooms that had been full of muttered fears emptied into laughter and milk and new small shoes left on the mat. Preston and Emma aged by measures that were neither swift nor sudden. Preston's hair silvered and the set of his shoulders softened, but there remained in him a fierce readiness to stand up early and see what work demanded. Emma's hands bore the map of the years, faint scars, the softening of skin where a lifetime of stirring had worn it thin, but also a steadiness that made her seem as if she were the hinge upon which the household turned. They learned, in time, to amuse each other with small economies. Preston would bring in firewood without announcing it. Emma would leave a cup near the bed so he could take tea without stumbling in the dark. They learned how to be tender in words as well as in work. Illness came like a wind that tests a house. There were fevers that lingered and nights that swallowed sleep. On one winter, when snow piled white and close around the buildings, Preston fell ill in a way that lessened him for a while and made the family realize how much of their life depended on his presence.
For days, Emma sat by the bed and read aloud from the same book, until Preston could repeat lines with a throat rough from fever. Jacob and Sarah took turns bringing broth. The children ran errands, small, solemn business that made them feel grown. The illness passed, as illnesses often do, under the steady tending of the household, and when Preston rose again, he was slower, but with a look that had a kind of brightened reserve, an acknowledgement of the fragility that had always been part of being alive. They buried no one kitchen still in these years, save for the sorrows of neighbors and the old man Harlan, whose death brought the town out in a way that made even the children whisper of mortality with new understanding.
The house at Hallbrook kept on, a place of labor and light and the ordinary making of life. The apple tree shaded new generations, and the porch remained the favored place for conversations that mended small hurts. In the evenings, when the chores were done and the children were off in bed or helping with a last dish, the house would fill with an easy quiet. Emma would rock the smallest child on her knee, humming, not out of need, but because the tune was a finger pressed to the seam of all that had been. Preston would sit in the doorway and smoke a pipe he had taken up in his older years, the smoke curling in a lazy column up into the dark. They would talk of nothing in particular, plans for spring, a repair that must be made, a neighbor's calf, and in that speech there was a contentment free of boasting. Once, many years after the gunshot that had once rattled the place into a new life, Emma walked to the orchard at dusk and stood beneath the apple tree. The branches moved in a wind that had learned to be tender, and the fruit hung like small lamps. She thought of Thomas, of the hole his leaving had left, and the way that hole had been filled by many small hands and much patient work. She thought of Preston, who had come into their lives not to erase the past, but to walk with them into a future. She thought of the children, and of the line that stretched forward, not straight and unbroken, but braided with the scars and the songs of those who had gone before. Emma reached up and touched a low branch and felt the rough skin of bark. For a long moment she let her forehead rest against the trunk, feeling the slow, immense life within it. The image of Thomas rose, not as a chain of grief, but as a man who had planted a beginning, someone whose memory could be honored by the joy and steadiness that had followed. She smiled then, small and fierce, like someone who has kept faith with both mourning and gladness. Preston came up behind her and took her hand. There was no speech, there need not be. They stood like two figures made patient by years, tethered to a place and to each other. Above them, the first stars pricked through, cool and unjudging. The plain lay open and true, and the house behind them held the light of lamps and the quiet of sleeping children. There are endings that arrive with resolutions, and endings that arrive simply because the day is done. In that moment beneath the apple tree, the story of the Hallbrooks settled into the kind of peace that is the work of decades, the peace of people who have learned how to keep one another and to let the past teach rather than imprison. Emma lifted her face to the sky, and Preston squeezed her hand, and the world, wide and honest as it had always been, turned toward the next day. There are endings that arrive with resolutions, and endings that arrive simply because the day is done. In that moment beneath the apple tree, the story of the Hallbrooks settled into the kind of peace that is the work of decades, the peace of people who have learned how to keep one another and to let the past teach rather than imprison. Emma lifted her face to the sky, and Preston squeezed her hand, and the world, wide and honest as it had always been, turned toward the next day.